San Antonio till I was 13 and went to junior high first there, and then finished up my junior high in West Hartford, Connecticut. We had a real interesting school in William Hall High in West Hartford. And I managed to get into Princeton in the class of 40. When I had been in high school, my chemistry professor had been sort of an enthusiastic fellow, and my dad sort of had ideas that maybe I'd like to get into engineering. Well, I wound up combining those to get chemical engineering, which was a little bit of a new field even for Princeton at that time. They didn't have a doctorate as a regular thing, but I got my undergraduate and master's degree at University of Princeton University, and I got acquainted with the work that was done in connection with someone who I knew who worked for one of the Pews, Arthur Pugh, and she encouraged me to go and have an interview at Sun Oil. Well, it turned out that they had a fellow from Hoodry there. When I went in for the interview, his name was Roger Newton, and I wound up working for the Catalytic Development Company. It wasn't Hoodry at that time, but Eugene Hoodry was the mainstay.
What time was that?
That was 1941, on the 14, the Bastille Day. This is appropriate because Hoodry was a Frenchman, so I always joked about the fact that I went to work at Hoodry on Bastille Day, July the 14th, 1941. I worked in the engineering department as a operator on the units out in the pilot plant when I first got there, and it was an exciting time, I must say, although at one point I was doing some studies on heat transfer, and on December 5th of 1941 I folded up that the folder on heat transfer and put it in my file cabinet. Went off for a weekend trip up to New York City. Well, Sunday I took my date to the Radio City Music Hall, and as we came out and got on a Fifth Avenue bus, the bus driver told us about Pearl Harbor. Well, I went home, or rather back to my place in Swarthmore, Pennsylvania, where I'd gotten a room, and Monday morning I went into work at 8 o'clock, and the entire laboratory was geared for aviation gasoline. That was Monday morning, December 8th. Eugene Hoodry knew that the Allies needed gasoline, aviation gasoline, and he immediately turned everybody. So I never opened that book on that folder on heat transfer again. We went to work on preparing catalysts that would be useful for the war effort, and Eugene Hoodry had the foresight to see that this was a needed thing. And of course, Hoodry had already developed a synthetic pelleted catalyst. People will laugh at this today, but it was the old fixed bed unit that we were using for cracking and producing high-octane gasoline. And the pellet catalyst was a synthetic. It was expensive to make, but it was unique. It had a porosity that gave it very good effectiveness in cracking. And for the old fixed bed, it was a wonderful catalyst to produce a lot of high-octane gasoline. And Sun, with its background, was able to put its own money into building a plant that would produce a lot of gasoline. And of course, patents were pooled at that time for the war effort, and other people built plants which were taking advantage of the Houdry development. Eugene Houdry was a very enthusiastic sort of person. In the old days, he used to go out in the pilot unit, and on a Saturday, he'd go and sit in a chair and lean back, and he'd watch the operators with the fixed bed units go through the paces, the cycles of on-stream, purge, and regeneration, and he'd cheer when he'd see the pattern develop in a repetitive manner so that it was a useful operation. Of course, Eugene was enthusiastic about doing what he had in mind, and when obligations came along for customers in later years, this presented some problems for the people that worked in the laboratory. He'd work till 10 or 11 at night, go home and maybe come in at 10 in the morning, but the fellows in the lab had to show up at 8 o'clock. And this was a little difficult. But this was ironed out. Of course, you may know that Houdry had come over from France when he wanted high-octane gasoline for his racing car. In France, he was unable to get any backing in France, so he came to the United States back in the late 20s or early 30s, and Ciccone backed him for a while, but nothing was coming of it, and so he asked if he could go to Sun. Well, while he was at Sun, I'm going back, of course, but while he was at Sun, the idea of regeneration really began to take shape. People hadn't really thought of regenerating catalysts before that, but that was what made the Houdry process work, was the ability to clean up the catalyst by regenerating it, burning it off, and running over again, and leaving the same batch of catalyst in there for many cycles. When Eugene Houdry first started with this effort, I think Warren Fred Farragher and George Bond and several others joined him. George Bond was an interesting fellow. He was a chemist, and he was charged with making the catalyst for the effort that at the Catalytic Development Company. And he had a system for secrecy in which he used the names of the counties in New Jersey, where he lived, Cumberland County, as the identification of the catalyst. So you'd have a CBL or something like that, which would be a certain formulation. Nobody knew but George what that formulation was. Well, this was a little hard to code unless you knew the whole system, but George sometimes would be working on something, and somebody come by his lab and he'd say, smells interesting, doesn't it? But he wouldn't tell people what he was doing exactly. But this was part of the secrecy that Houdry wanted to maintain, and it was successful in the first years of the operation there.
What do you think made Houdry want to keep those things secret that way? Was this his nature, or?
It was a competitive situation. He realized that if this got out to any of the oil companies, there would be a clamor to know how to do it, and he wanted to keep the catalyst so he could patent them. He really wanted to get patents that would hold up. I know during the war, Art Shabaker and I went to various places in Indiana and Florida, actually digging up clays that might be active catalysts. When I went down to Florida, near Gainesville, we were looking at a kaolin deposit that had shown some interesting properties as a cracking catalyst, actually, even raw, the raw kaolin. Well, I was assigned a young what was he? He worked for the Sun Oil Company to drive me around. And when I went into the Sun offices in nearby city, they had a rather peculiar rapport with other oil companies. They would all come in to the offices and try to determine where Sun was going to buy up a lease next, whatnot. And they quizzed me who I was, and I didn't let on that I was from Houdry, because that would have keyed them to an entirely different light. I just didn't say I wasn't from Sun, and we went out into the boondocks around Gainesville there and tried to use a drill, a regular oil drilling equipment. The fellow who was assigned to my driving me around was familiar with this sort of equipment, and we tried to take core drills with that oil drilling equipment. Well, that didn't work very well. The clay was in lenses with sand in between, and quicksand at that. And so you'd pull the core up and it would just drain out. Well, we finally hired some local labor and used hand core drills. We just twist them down there and we pulled up, and we got a map of all the area. And I know when I took my area back, my equipment back to all that I'd gained from the samples and my map back to Art Shabaker, he said, "Well, why did you not get into this area?" I said, "Well, there's rattlesnakes in there," so we stayed out. And then when Art Shabaker and I went to Huron, Indiana, to dig out some halloysite, that was quite a different thing. We went back in a cave that hadn't been used for years. I remember Art with a hammer trying to chop off a sample off the top, and I was a little afraid it was going to bring down the ceiling on us. But we brought back samples, and they were interesting cracking catalysts too, but way orders of magnitude lower in activity than anything like the zeolites today, of course. Well, Alex Mills and Alec Oblad and people like, let's see, I try to think of the names, but they developed the further information on acid catalysts, acidity, and catalytic activity. Of course, it had been known for years that catalyst function was acidic, but they had a lot to do with the development of that knowledge at that time. And Harry Millikan, my boss for some years, was an innovative fellow. He did a lot in, he had patents which incorporated the idea of base exchange to ammonium ion exchange out the sodium. That was the first way of getting a practical catalyst. We had to base exchange the sodium out. Even the clay catalysts that were first used, you had to get the sodium out to make them useful. We did a lot in acid leaching of clays and hydrothermal pressure treating of clays, and tried to develop cheaper substitutes for the synthetic that was so effective in cracking. Alec Mills had the ability to, in my judgment, get the most out of any employee that was working for him. For instance, L. Herrick was a little bit of an oddball, but he came up with an investigation of some crud that showed up in a heat treater when they were heat treating something that had involved diamines in the production of the catalyst in the first place. Well, this solid showed up, and he was curious about it. And it was fortunate for Houdry that he was curious, because he developed the structure for it, and it was diazo bicyclooctane. Now that's a very compact structure of a benzene ring with a connection with nitrogen top and bottom, and this structure was worked out, and ways of making this were worked out. We had a consultant down from the University of Rochester, and I have his name here. I'm sure I can develop it somewhere. But he was Milton Orchin. And he took one look at that structure. He said, that ought to be a good catalyst for polyurethane. He was right. And of course, this brought in a good many $1 million for Houdry. There was the interest in a product that was causing us trouble in the heat treat. The chemist was perceptive enough to find out what it was, and here we had a consultant who had the knowledge that said to him that this would be a good catalyst. Well, it was a very useful combination as a different kind of catalyst from what you might think of with the old catalyst, the Houdry organization.
Well, what was it that made Al Herrick such an oddball?
Well, he was, I'll say, a womanizer.
Oh. And successful, presumably.
Yeah. But, and he used to make it a little difficult for the secretaries in the laboratory. He'd go around and visit each one with a cup of coffee in his hands, you know, and Alex would sort of remind him about this, but it was incurable. So but here, L. Herrick, his patent was the one that was very significant in that effort.
Well, at that time, how did Milton Orchin operate as a consultant? Did he just visit certain people?
He'd come in on a regular, every several months basis, and talk with anyone who might be interested in talking with him, whether it was the catalyst group, or the inorganic catalyst group, or the organic product group, or whatever it was. And Alec Mills would assign time for anyone who wanted to talk with him. And I used to talk with him at times, and and he was a very effective consultant for Houdry.
Well, was he a unique one, or were there several consultants
there were a
at the
number
time?
of other, although my memory of it was that he was as regular as any that we had. Of course, I was in the research department, and so I saw this. We had people at Houdry like Rofi Bland and George Schimpf, and I mentioned George Bond and Art Shabaker and Dr. Farragher. Dr. Farragher was there from 1931 with Eugene Houdry, and in later years, during World War II, he was still at Houdry, and he became, he was asked by the Intelligence Department of the United States to go over to Germany and determine what would be useful in the way of German engineering and German innovations in chemical catalyst work. And he had a very comprehensive report that was cited by the Army. They felt that he had contributed greatly to the industrial intelligence for the United States in that regard. Well, I remember some sort of amusing things with regard to Eugene Houdry. One time down in the old catalyst lab, which was down actually within the confines of the Sun Oil Refinery, although it was the Catalytic Development Company at the time, which was the precursor of Houdry Process Corporation. My boss, Harry Milliken, as I said, was an innovative experimenter, and he had developed ways of making bead catalyst independent of how Ciccone was making them. What he decided to do was to get a more continuous process. So he patented a piece of equipment which worked on an annulus of oil in a drum about this big around, and he would spray the ingredients of sodium silicate, sodium aluminate, and ammonium sulfate, or in some cases aluminum sulfate and sodium silicate, to produce a sol which would squirt out from the back end of the revolving mixing head and lay down on top of the oil and pull up in beads when it went through about 1.5 feet of oil, and then be carried by a sluice slicker of salt solution down below that out into a bin where it was screened out, and the sluice slicker returned to this for recycling, and then the beads would be carried down into a dryer or aged first. And incidentally, aging brings up an interesting memory. Back at the time they first started up the old synthetic silica alumina pellet cracking catalyst, Art Shabaker was engineer in charge, and they had developed in the laboratory in Procter & Schwartz ovens a method of drying large quantities of hydrogel. I say large quantities for a laboratory. And they piled it up fairly thickly on screen trays. Well, turned out that it took hours for that hydrogel to lose its water and become dry. And when the Procter & Schwartz people came in to look at the drying, they just thought in terms of drying things fast, and so they developed this continuous equipment for drying, and boy, it dried it quickly all right in a tunnel dryer with a conveyor belt. But the product that came out the other end was entirely different from the product they'd seen out of the laboratory. It was sandy, grainy stuff instead of fluffy, pulpy product. And I know the engineer who was involved in the grinding took Shea Baker aside and said, "Is this the same stuff they showed us?" You know, well, it wasn't. It was quite different. Well, it turned out that they had mountains of this stuff coming out the other end of the, and it was useless. They couldn't handle it, and they're further down the line. They couldn't cast it. It wouldn't make pellets, and so they finally discovered that they had to steam treat it. So they just added a section into the dryer where they steam treated the wet gel before it got dry, and they were all right. But that was a headache for a while.
And what time was this? What year?
That was back in '36. I'm reverting back. Because the first, or 30, maybe 37, 38, the first cracking unit went on stream with a activated bentonite catalyst. This was sodium bentonite that had the sodium leached out of it by base exchange with ammonium ion. And as I said, Harry Millikan was responsible for that development and had a patent on it. And the Filtrol people had put out this product that was used for gasoline treating. Well, it didn't have the low sodium that was necessary for cracking to make an acid function effective, and it was the ammonium exchange that made it possible to use that as a cracking catalyst. But that was the first cracking catalyst. That was activated bentonite made by the Filtrol Corporation. But it had to be base exchange in order for it to be an effective cracking catalyst. It was dead otherwise. But we used to get the opportunity to go to Gordon conferences in the summertime, the Catalysis or the ion exchange or organic or what have you, and that was always a treat for any of the research group. And then the Alec Mills was particularly enthusiastic about having everybody to have an opportunity to get to meetings like that. And then when Alec and Burt Farkas and I guess Harold Shallett and Heinz Heinemann got together and decided that it might be a good idea to have a catalysis club, that was what developed into the original Catalysis Club in Philadelphia. And ultimately, they got enthusiastic about having it become international. And of course, the first catalyst meeting of any wide significance was the one in Philadelphia in 1956. And we, of course, went there in pretty good force from the Hoodry organization, and Sun Oil did too. And then in 1960, there must have been a dozen of us went from Hoodry to the Paris Catalysis meeting, and that was a memorable occasion, I must say. I can remember wondering whether the Russians were going to show up. It was getting late in the beginning of the week, and nobody had heard from the Russians. And finally they did show up, and I remember our friend from Princeton,
Turkevich,
being sort of interpreter for everybody and getting into great arguments with them. And the lady who was in charge of the group, her name slips me at the moment, but it was Topchieva. She was, I remember there was an argument between Turkevich and Topchieva about certain aspects of catalysis. That was sort of a fun thing to see. But Turkevich, he wouldn't back down.
Did they argue in Russian or English?
Yes, he'd switch back and forth.
And this was the Philadelphia meeting?
Yeah, the Paris meeting.
Paris
meeting, yeah. In 1960. And then a number of us got to the one in Amsterdam in 1964. That was an interesting time. I remember I stayed at the university, the place where the university ordinarily during the school year would be utilizing the rooms and whatnot. And I went out on a Sunday morning when they didn't have any meeting and rented a bicycle from the railroad station. And the fellow had, hundreds of bikes there, and he let me take it without any deposit or anything. I was quite impressed, and I bicycled for some 25 or 30 miles around Amsterdam that day. Had a wonderful time taking pictures and whatnot. But that was a memorable meeting too. I'd like to revert back to the Paris meeting, something that's amusing that comes to me. We went to the Thursday evening dinner, and these two fellows from the Netherlands sat across from us, my wife and myself, at the table. And they were being very polite and making conversation, and the one of them spoke up and said, you saw my wife had ginger ale and I had ginger ale. And he said, "Oh, I see you are an exhibitionist." And his companion jumped on him right away and started to remand him, and said, he was very embarrassed. He says, "Oh, I meant prohibitionist." And 4 years later, when I got to the meeting in Amsterdam, I bumped into these two fellows, and one of them said to me, "Has your wife forgiven me?"
Well, now, did your wife bicycle around with you those 25?
No, she wasn't at the Amsterdam meeting. She was with me at the Paris meeting, but not at the Amsterdam. But we had a very much of a family sort of feeling at Hoodry in the early days. There was what you might call a sort of a critical mass of technical people there that allowed us to produce quite a lot of papers and innovations. Some of them were kept internally, of course, many of them, but we were allowed to publish. In fact, Alec Mills and Alec Oblad very much encouraged our publications, and this was certainly a wonderful way to grow in the field of catalysis. And in years later, we would go to Gordon conferences and find quite an alumni group from the Houdry organization that had branched out and gone elsewhere.
What was it that made Millikan so innovative? Is it
Well,
easy to describe?
He was, I remember one time he got the idea that it might be interesting to make bead catalyst without involving a lot of paraphernalia. So our foreman in the pilot plant catalyst group got up on the roof of this one-story building with a basket. And what does Harry Millikan do but squirt the mixing head with the sol in it up in the air so the foreman could collect the beads in a basket. And indeed, they did form into beads as they went through the air. It was a matter of controlling the pH and the product concentration to the right degree to get the gel to set from the sol in, a fraction of a second. But Harry was pretty innovative. He even went so far as to build his own house in Rose Valley, and he would hire some of the welders on their off hours, Houdry welders and Houdry people who worked in a shop, and he built that home with the idea of having sodium sulfate decahydrate in cans in the basement. And he passed ethylene glycol around those cans and pumped it out to a device in the backyard that would collect the sun's rays. Now this was back in the early 40s, and or it was after the war, of course, but or the mid-40s there somewhere. And he built this house which was of stainless steel with steel posts, and the stainless steel was under tension. He had insulation in between. He put that building with an overhang in the proper place so that he would take advantage of the overhang in the summer and not get heat into his house unnecessarily, and yet it would be efficient in the wintertime. Now this was one of the early developments, as far as I know, of somebody actually going out. That was Harry Millikan. Well, he was that innovative in the catalyst laboratory. He was always thinking up things, and he was an interesting guy to work for. I admired him very highly. But unfortunately, the fellow he had engaged to build his plastic lenses didn't come through for him. So he had a hitch there in his equipment, but it was properly designed, and as a matter of fact, he had a gas heater backup, and he hardly had to use that even without the solar assist, because he had developed it so well with the proper sighting and proper insulation and whatnot that he utilized the heat that was there very effectively. But
How would you describe him as a person?
he was a sort of a little bit abrasive redhead with what you might find was a little sharp at times, but he was very fair, and he had two youngsters, I guess 2 youngsters, and was very solicitous of his wife and family, but he oftentimes would work off to himself. Sometimes he resisted coming to technical meetings, although he was very effective when he came to Gordon Conference meetings and whatnot, but he liked to work. He got help from everybody around him, but he didn't particularly like to blow his own horn, but he was a very effective guy. Later years, he was head of a play company out in the West, I think. I haven't been in touch with him in many years. But,
when you were going to pick up these clay samples, was this during the war or
yes, it was during the war.
And how did you travel?
Well, I went down by train, and this Sun Oil geologist who was assigned to take me around had all the, what do you call them, stamps that he needed to get gasoline. He had a 1942 Chevrolet, pretty brand new. And we get up in the morning at maybe 5 o'clock and head out for the deposit. And he would do what he called ramble. He'd get up to 90 miles an hour on the highway. When he'd go off into the brush, he'd slow down to 45. And he'd go over trees and brush and whatnot. I had one morning we were zipping down the highway and I heard this. I said, "Do you maybe have a bubble on your tire?" He pulled over the side, and he did. But one time, when we wanted to get the hand drilling equipment, it was a Sunday morning. Well, he was very resourceful too, and we go out and he finds where this core drill equipment was. It was a great big long thing. No, that was I beg your pardon, that was the core drill for the power equipment before we ran into the problems. Well, anyway, he needed to carry it on his Chevrolet. What does he do? He goes over to some farmer's wire fence and takes his pliers out and clips some of the wire and ties it around the front bumper and the back bumper of the car underneath the car. And, you know, if that slipped, when we're doing down the road, we'd take a somersault, but it was that heavy. But we had the gasoline to get around. I remember one time he took me on a Sunday night to a southern church. The black people down there were very enthusiastic about their church, and we went to the back door, which was open, and watched that congregation, and the preacher would exhort everyone there to join in the singing and whatnot, and it was an interesting sight to see. Another time he took me to an Esso picnic. Now, as I said, the different oil companies sort of sashayed around with each other. And we went to an SO picnic. This is a son of a man taking me to an SO picnic on a Sunday afternoon. And I remember we had a wonderful barbecue. But there'd be people from, you know, Continental and all the southern oil companies, as well as Esso and Sun Oil and everybody. But there was a camaraderie about it. They never did find out where I was from.
Now, what was Sun doing in the Gainesville area at that time? Was this just the sales
Drilling
office?
for oil.
Drilling?
Yeah, yeah. They had, well, it wasn't Gainesville. It was up along the Panhandle.
Oh, okay.
But we went down to Gainesville to do this digging, and we stayed in a hotel in Gainesville. But
and when did they start the synthetic silica alumina catalyst, and what led them to that?
well, that was about 1938-39, and Alec Mills came from Saskatchewan and from Columbia University, and I think he was there maybe 2 years before I got to Catalytic Development Company, and they had, well, Harry Millikan had a lot to do with the early development of that synthetic catalyst. They began to recognize that acid function was very important, and of course zeolites were effective catalysts, so they made a synthetic zeolite. That's what they did, and it was not a crystalline zeolite, but it was a zeolite. Well, we theorized that crystalline zeolite should be active catalyst. We tried to take the sodium out of natrolite, and we did. We succeeded in getting the sodium out of natrolite. But natrolite has how big an opening? It's pretty small, and it didn't work. We hydrothermally treated with ammonium salt to get the sodium out of natrolite. It worked under pressure at temperatures like 450 Fahrenheit or 500 Fahrenheit, under pressure. And we succeeded in getting the sodium out, but it wasn't a cracking catalyst. It came for Barrer's finding that larger opening zeolites, crystalline zeolites, could be made, and then the Ciccone people latched onto that, and we didn't know what that story was. I had an interesting call from my old professor at Princeton University one time.
Who was he?
I have to get back to that, but he asked me about a paper that I had given in 1951.
Keep talking, I'm just...
1951, New York, which had to do with synthetic zeolites of the non-crystalline type, in which we did a lot of base exchange work and a lot of formulation work, taking sodium silicate and sodium aluminate and ammonium sulfate, and then sodium silicate, aluminum sulfate, and making synthetic gels. And we had studied the characteristics of these gels in the hydrogel form and in the dry gel form, and discovered that we could base exchange the sodium out to even when there was as much as 10% alumina in a silica alumina synthetic gel, if we did it while it was in the hydrogel condition. And we could get a 1-for-1 acid function development for every aluminum that was there. We determined that. But we did not determine the step further that Ciccone had found, that the crystalline products were more effective. My former professor called me. Evidently, he was working as a consultant for somebody like Ciccone, and he was trying to fish around to see what I knew, if I knew anything about these crystalline zeolites. Well, I didn't. We came so close because we were, on the one hand, doing a lot of formulation work of synthetic gels, silica alumina gels. On the other hand, we were doing hydrothermal pressure treat work. But we didn't come up with the right combination. We didn't find Barrer's reference.
Why do you think that you never developed zeolites? For example, in 1950, Mill's paper mentioned zeolites in a cracking paper.
Yes, and as I say, we took sodium natrolite and took the sodium out of it, and it wasn't effective. But Alec Mills was talking about zeolites of the non-crystalline time at that type.
Is that what he was?
I believe. So it was only after what was it, the South African patents came out that we learned that the crystalline zeolite. Now this was despite the fact that the old Catalytic Development Company was a combination of Eugene Houdry's Frenchman, Ciccone vacuums 1/3, and Sun Oil's 1/3. But then it became, after the Catalytic Development Company, it became the Houdry Process Company first, and then corporation. And of course, Sun bought out Ciccone's rights. Of course, Ciccone became that name left too, the old vacuum oil company, and then the Ciccone vacuum, and then
Ciccone Mobile.
Mobile now. But as I say, even though there had been that close working together in the earlier years, we didn't have the knowledge of the crystalline zeolites until the patent came out.
How would you compare the Mills of 1941 to the Mills of today?
He's an enthusiastic guy no matter what. And I think he carried that enthusiasm always with whatever he did. He worked for the government for a number of years, and I didn't really have too close contact with him at that time, but I know when I went to the Oblad symposium in Utah a few years back, I was standing in line at and up comes Alec Mills behind me. He'd just flown in from Japan, I think, working for the government, and he was the same guy that I had known before. I admire him for his ever-present enthusiastic approach to things. I always appreciated Alec because, as I say, I think he knew how to get the best out of anyone that worked for him.
Now, in research, was he more methodical than, let's say, Millikan, or was he creative?
Well, he was somewhat more methodical, I think. Millikan tended to be going into the things sometimes a little more deeply as far as trying to relate solid state structure to catalyst behavior and whatnot. But Alec Mills contributed greatly to the knowledge of the useful acid function and the platinum reforming catalyst. Alec and I, and I guess well, think of the other name, Saul Weller, wrote a paper for the Paris conference on catalysis that had to do with reforming catalysts, and when we came out with that paper, there were a lot of questions from the field that showed they learned something from that paper. I think there was a little reluctance on the part of some management in the Houdry organization on that score, but Alex wasn't afraid to bring things out that had been learned and wanted to learn what others were doing and let them know in on what we were doing to make progress.
Now, what was Saul Weller doing at Houdry, and how did he come there?
Saul was a very top flight experimenter, and he did some very thorough studies. He, with Sterling Volz, did a great deal of studies in more of the theoretical end of catalyst preparation and catalyst making and catalyst performance in particular, really.